Sometimes in the New Testament, we get a nice connection between the Apostle Paul's letter to a church, known as the epistles, and a story from the book of Acts describing his ministry to that church, or even the founding of the church. This is one of those places, and we'll get another example next week with the church of Corinth, where there's a passage from Acts and then there's a letter to Corinth. The connection here is that Acts tells us the story of Paul founding the church of Thessalonica. Now, Paul was a very active missionary. He traveled all over Asia Minor and Greece, sharing his message. He would start in Antioch usually. On his first journey, he traveled through Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, about halfway into the central part of Asia Minor, and then turned around and came back to Antioch by way of Cyprus. In his second missionary journey, he traveled all the way through Asia Minor, all the way up to Greece, which is where he arrived in Thessalonica. And then he traveled through Athens and all the way back to Antioch. And then on a third journey, he traveled a very similar route. And then on a fourth journey, he went to Rome. So he was very, very active traveler. We get the story of Thessalonica from the very beginning, when Paul first arrives in the town. He goes to the local synagogue and he starts trying to convince people that Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified, is the Messiah that the Jews have been waiting for. That's a pretty tough sell, given that suffering and dying is not what Messiahs are supposed to do. Messiahs are supposed to liberate. Messiahs are supposed to lead. We learn in Acts that at first Paul was only marginally successful in Thessalonica. It says he convinced a few Jews, some devout Greeks. Devout Greeks were probably non-Jewish people who were attracted to the Jewish religion. We're also told that he convinced a number of leading women to come with him. Now, the way women are mentioned specifically here is probably intentional documentation of the instrumental role that women played in the spread of Christianity. Women in particular may have been attracted to the early church as a promising new religious community where they could have a more equal standing than they experienced at that time in Judaism. So we have that story of the very beginning of the church of Thessalonica, and then we have Paul's letter to that same church known as 1 Thessalonians. This is a letter filled with love and affection and praise for the congregation that he founded. He was not in Thessalonica very long, at least not the first time, so the very existence of this church and his feelings toward it is a testimony to his skills as an organizer, a pastor, and a communicator. 1 Thessalonians was actually written before the book of Acts was written. Before the author of Acts sat down to write the history of the early church, Paul wrote his letter to Thessalonica. It's believed to be the oldest book in the New Testament, written somewhere between 41 and 49 BCE, which is remarkable if we think that Jesus was crucified in 31 or 33. That means this letter was written only 10 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. So in that 10 years, Jesus dies and he's raised. The disciples become apostles, and some stay in Jerusalem to form a church, but others started traveling all around the world to spread the message of the gospel. It's even thought that one disciple, Thomas, traveled all the way to India to found a church, and that church is still in existence today, and they trace their founding back to the disciple Thomas. Then at some point early in the process of the spread of this church, Paul has his vision of Christ. Now, Paul was not a disciple of Jesus. He never met Jesus. But sometime early in the Jesus movement, as it was spreading around Judea and often into Asia Minor, Paul is a Pharisee and he's persecuting Christians. So he's on the other side. And as he's riding on his horse to Damascus, he has a vision of Christ and he is converted. He falls off his horse, he goes blind and he's converted. Eventually he regains his sight and he spent some time in isolation. And after that, he started his aggressive ministry to spread the gospel and to convert people to Christianity. That's what brought him eventually to Thessalonica in our passage from Acts. Today, I want to focus our attention on the reading from Acts because it contains an accusation made against the early Christians. And I think it's an accusation that we should aspire to have made against us today. We want people to accuse us of this. The accusation is that the early Christians are turning the world upside down. In our passage, Paul and Silas is his colleague in ministry, enter Thessalonica, and they go to the local synagogue. That's Paul's MO. He traveled from city to city. He didn't go to the rural areas. He went to the cities, and he always started by visiting the synagogue and trying to convince the people there that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, died, and rose from the dead, and that this same Jesus of Nazareth was and still is the Messiah that they had all been waiting for. Now, as I said, that was a hard sell because Messiahs are not supposed to, what they are supposed to do is take on the powerful, take on the oppressors, and win the day. They are supposed to liberate and lead. They're not supposed to get crucified. But Paul was remarkably effective at reframing the crucifixion of Jesus as more than just a political execution, but instead as a mystical act of universal redemption. And then he also was able to frame the resurrection of Jesus after he convinced people that it happened. He was able to reframe that as an ultimate victory over all forms of oppression. In fact, just by doing that, just by making that argument, he was already turning things upside down just with his message. Then the passage tells us that the Jews were jealous. That could also be translated as zealous. So either they were jealous that Paul was taking people away from their synagogue to his movement, which is possible, or they were zealous about their faith, and they did not appreciate Paul trying to turn their doctrines upside down. We can probably imagine if someone came to Govans one day and made the argument that Jesus was some kind of hardcore free market capitalist, we might react zealously as well. We might say that's not what Jesus was about. Regardless, these folks formed a mob and they could not find Paul and Silas for some reason, so they went after the folks who were hosting them, Jason and a few of the other believers. They arrest Jason and the other believers and bring them to the city authorities. That's when we hear their accusation against these Christians. They are turning the world upside down. They also go on to say they are acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying there is another king named Jesus. Both accusations are actually great compliments to the early Christians. The second one as much as the first. The second one says that these Christians, they do not worship the emperor. They do not worship the empire. Instead, they worship Jesus. They're saying that Christians refuse to celebrate what the emperor stands for, the power, the violence, the inequality of the empire. And instead, they are criticizing those things by celebrating all that Jesus stands for: love, kindness, self-sacrifice, and compassion. They are acting contrary to the decrees of the emperor, saying there is another king named Jesus. May the same thing be said about all of us. But the first criticism is more quotable. They are turning the world upside down. My message today is simple. We are being called to do this very same thing today. From the birth of Jesus in a manger to his teachings on the mountain to his empowering death on the cross, we are being called to take power away from the kings and emperors of our day and instead to lift up the powerless. We are being called to stop overvaluing some people and instead to value all people as children of God. We're called to discard our propensity to cast some people aside and instead to cherish all those who have been thrown away and trampled underfoot. We are called to stop allowing the haves to have more and more and more, and instead to be sure that the have-nots have enough. We're called to hush those who speak too much and to give voice to those who have been silenced. We're called to give less attention to what is being said by the white men in the room and more attention to what is being said by the women of color. We're being called to identify those groups who have been beaten down by institutional discrimination and to atone for the sins committed against whole groups of people in our name. We're called to put aside profit and convenience and comfort, and instead to value God's creation as the greatest gift that we have been given, intended to be shared by all. We're called to be less entrenched in the way things have always been and more open to the visions and voices of youth.
My name is Naomi and I'm 11 years old. Me and my friend Carter led a walkout at our elementary school on the 14th. We walked out for 18 minutes, adding a minute to honor Cortland Arrington, an African-American girl who was the victim of gun violence in her school in Alabama after the Parkland shooting. I am here today to represent Cortland Arrington. I am here today to represent Hadia Pendleton. I am here today to represent Tiana Thompson, who at just 16 was shot dead in her home here in Washington, D.C. I am here today to acknowledge and represent the African-American girls whose stories don't make the front page of every national newspaper. Whose stories don't lead on the evening news. I represent the African-American women who are victims of gun violence, who are simply statistics instead of vibrant, beautiful girls that full of potential. It is my privilege to be here today. I am indeed full of privilege. My voice has been heard. I am here to acknowledge their stories, to say they matter, to say their names, because I can, and I was asked to be. For far too long, these names, these Black girls and women, have been just numbers. I'm here to say never again for those girls too. I am here to say that everyone should value those girls too. People have said that I am too young to have these thoughts on my own. People have said that I am a tool of some nameless adult. It's not true. My friends and I might still be 11, and we might still be in elementary school, but we know life isn't equal for everyone, and we know what is right and wrong. We also know that we stand in the shadow of the Capitol, and we know that we have 7 short years until we too have the right to vote. So I'm here today to honor the words of Toni Morrison. If there is a book that you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, you must be the one to write it. I urge everyone here and everyone who hears my voice to join me in telling the stories that aren't told. To honor the girls, the women of color who were murdered at disproportionate rates in this nation. I urge each of you to help me write the narrative for this world and understand so that these girls and women are never forgotten. Thank you.
Like the early Christians 2,000 years ago, like this young woman, like all her peers today, we are called today to turn the world upside down. Biblical scholar, Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann writes in the book Prophetic Imagination, he says quite clearly, the one thing the dominant culture cannot tolerate or co-opt is compassion, the ability to stand in solidarity with the victims of the present order. It can manage charity and good intentions, but it has no way to resist solidarity with pain or grief. In the crucifixion, Jesus practiced the ultimate solidarity with the victims of this world order. He practiced solidarity with all those who walk through the valley of the shadow of death, And in so doing, he grabbed hold of a world where power and wealth and comfort are given only to a few, and he turned it upside down. We are called to do the same, to stand in solidarity with the powerless and work toward a time when we as individuals and we as a church will stand before the powers of our own day, and we too will be accused of turning the world upside down. Amen.